Hello, I'm Jim Watts, professor in the Department of Religion, and in the spring of 2021, a symposium fellow in the Humanities Center at Syracuse University. Have you ever heard the word Jubilee? These days, it's most often used to refer just to a big anniversary, like a 25th or 50th wedding anniversary, or a similar anniversary of an important event. The Catholic Church regularly declares jubilees, usually every 50 years, as years for focusing especially on coming back to God and repenting of one's sins. In the African American community, Jubilee marks the anniversaries of the days when slavery was abolished in the United States on January 1st, 1863, when Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and also the day in 2 years later, June 19th, Juneteenth of 1865, when that proclamation finally reached the furthest reaches of the Confederacy. Both of these are often celebrated today as jubilees. That usage of Jubilee to reflect liberation from slavery goes back to the Bible, specifically to the book of Leviticus, chapter 25. In this chapter, God declares to the Israelites that every 50 years they should liberate their slaves and return land back to the people who originally owned it. God declares in this chapter, the land is mine, it belongs to me. You, that is the Israelites, live with me like immigrant tenants. The idea here is that God gave to Israel not only land that God had promised to Abraham, but actually distributed that land to all the different families of the Israelites for them to farm and pass on to their descendants. And according to Leviticus 25, that land should always stay in the family. But ancient farmers, like modern farmers, often find themselves in debt. And if they're bad years for raising crops and they're droughts, they often find they can't repay the debts and have to sell their land. And in ancient times, if selling the land wasn't enough to pay off the debts, they often had to sell themselves and their families into slavery. We call this debt slavery, and it was a common problem in ancient cultures. Leviticus 25 legislates a solution to debt slavery by saying the land cannot really be sold because it belongs to God and God gave it to these families. So every 50 years, the land has to return to its original owner, unencumbered by debt, and any debt slaves among the Israelites have to be set free. So the declaration every 50 years is that you must proclaim liberty in the land to all of its residents. It will be a jubilee to you. This argument in Leviticus 25 uses a common form of rhetoric that tries to project an ideal future, the way the world should be, by recalling an ideal past, the way it once was, in this case, at the beginning of Israel's formation as a nation in the land. The argument is, it can be that way in the future because it has already been that way once in the past. This message of liberation that's associated with Jubilee is ironic because the same chapter that declares liberty to the captives also contains the clearest commandment in the Bible endorsing the institution of permanent slavery, not for Israelites, but for non-Israelites. It says, you may buy male and female slaves from the nations around you. You can bequeath them to your children after you to inherit as permanent property. These you may enslave. So the Israelites can be freed, have to be freed every 50 years according to these rules, but non-Israelites can be enslaved permanently and their children after them. In the early modern period, that is the 16th to the 18th centuries, when European colonial empires began to expand into Africa and especially into North and South America, these rules for slavery in the Bible were interpreted to apply in these new territories. In that context, it was understood that by Israelites was meant Christians, and non-Israelites meant non-Christians. So Christians should not be enslaved, at least permanently. Maybe they would be indentured as servants for a period of time by contract, but not permanently. But non-Israelites were open to be captured and put to forced labor. And this happened to millions and millions of Africans who were sent to the New World to work on plantations. It also happened to millions of Native Americans. However, many of those people actually converted to Christianity. And in order to keep the economic system working, the definition had to evolve. So what was originally a distinction between Christians and non-Christians became a distinction between Europeans and non-Europeans, and then it became a distinction between whites and blacks. So in these centuries, the 16th to the 18th centuries, slavery, which has been an institution that had been around forever, but for the first time in these centuries, slavery became racialized. The racial distinction determined who could be enslaved forever and who could not. This distinction was based in the Bible more than 3,000 years earlier, but now with the racial distinction added to it. My research in the Humanities Center this spring will focus on this history of the Bible's projection of an ideal past as a program for an ideal economic future for Israel. The biblical Jubilee is an example of rhetoric for change that uses memories of the past to make its future vision more convincing. The problem with building programs of reform on the past, though, is that memories of even what seem like the most golden ages carry with them baggage that is not so good, like slavery. But in the 18th and 19th century, in the Americas, an amazing thing happens. The ideal of the Jubilee, as expressed in the Bible, was embraced by slaves who sang about it and preached about it to motivate resistance and escape from their slaveholders. And it motivated abolitionists who campaigned to change the laws in order to get rid of the institution of slavery permanently. Before that time, no one ever really thought slavery could be abolished. Many people thought it was a terrible thing, it was a bad thing, but it's just one of those things that's part of human societies. But the biblical vision of Jubilee, of liberty, now motivated both slaves and abolitionists to resist, to change the laws where they could, and where they couldn't, to fight a bloody civil war in order to abolish the institution. And by the end of the 19th century, slavery had been outlawed almost everywhere in the world. So the ideal of the Jubilee overwhelmed pragmatic considerations in the end and produced a future even better than the biblical writers themselves could imagine.